This is a story about people who need help. It's also a story about supply and demand. Too many people, not enough help. And it's about what happens when tech companies fill the void.
I was having like 5 or 6 panic attacks a day. I started feeling really overwhelmed by that. I started trying to call normal therapists. That wasn't working. I couldn't find anyone. Nobody had time.
I was living my dream, but it became such a nightmare that I was dissociating. And that was when it was like, okay, I need to talk to someone. Like I need an expert on whatever is happening in my brain.
The mental health crisis meets the gig economy. Coming up on this edition of Business Beyond.
We just heard from Joe and Diego. We're not showing their faces or using their real names, but the stories they're telling are incredibly common.
According to the Global Burden of Disease study, there are 1 billion people living with a mental health disorder right now. 1 in 8 of us.
Most people don't receive effective care, even in rich countries with good social safety nets. Joe's an American living in Berlin. After getting nowhere in his search for a therapist, one night his mental health seriously deteriorated.
I was scared about how the night was going to end. The crisis lines, even though they claim they're 24 hours, there's one for each individual district in Berlin, and they're not all manned 24 hours. And they don't say that anywhere on the website. So I spent about 2 hours dialing every single line in Berlin, just letting it ring for multiple times until I eventually figured out that it was the Kreuzberg line that was manned 24 hours a day, and got through to somebody there who was insanely unhelpful.
The day after his experience with the crisis hotline, Joe went to see his regular doctor, who recognized he was in danger and fast-tracked him into the mental health care system.
When I finally got in to see her, she basically just looked at me and is like, yeah, okay, antidepressants for 2 years. I want you to go to a geschlossene Anstalt, so like a closed like institution where you can't leave for 2 weeks. And that's it. And I'm like, Jesus, you've talked to me for 3 minutes. Like, that's a radical step. And she's like, yeah, but this is what I recommend. I'm like, okay, well, I need more information. What are these drugs? Why do you want me to go away for 2 weeks? And I won't forget it. She literally looked at me and said, my waiting room is completely full right now. I don't have time to go into detail with you about any of this.
The problem in Germany isn't that there aren't enough therapists. It's that there are strict controls on how many of them can be licensed to accept public insurance, which most people have. Limiting supply keeps costs down for the insurers. Chronic underfunding is a global problem. Worldwide, only 2% of health budgets go into mental health care. And according to the World Health Organization, around 2/3 of that spending goes into an outdated model of care, psychiatric hospitals. The medical journal Lancet Psychiatry says major economic trends like precarious jobs, reduced prospects of home ownership, and unaffordable rent are contributing to youth mental health entering a dangerous phase. Other factors are social media use, conflicts, and the climate crisis.
Rachel lives in Ireland, which, according to a recent survey, is the hardest place within the EU to access mental health care.
I had heard anecdotally that, waiting times were huge, impossible to get appointments and so on. So I think I would have maybe done a cursory check of that and gone, oh God, that seems like the last thing that I have the headspace for at the moment.
Both Joe and Rachel ended up on an online therapy platform called Betterhelp. Now, if your algorithmic gods are anything like mine, you've probably seen their ads in your social media feeds. They're kind of everywhere.
I have been in therapy since I was 6 years old. My parents said, we want her to be emotionally intelligent, and that I am. I never stopped going to therapy.
Platforms like Betterhelp make getting started so easy. And you can change therapists as many times as you want, literally by just clicking a few buttons.
So here's the reminder. This time, choose yourself.
Betterhelp is just one of a host of online therapy brands that have popped up over the past few years. Many of them grew rapidly during the pandemic when telehealth took off.
Betterhelp was founded in 2013 and it's now owned by Teladoc Health, a publicly traded company. It's a subscription model with users billed between $260 and $400 monthly. They can chat with their therapists on video calls or via text.
BetterHelp's active user numbers fluctuate, but since its founding, close to 5 million people have used the service. The company employs around 35,000 therapists, mainly in the US and UK, but has also recently been recruiting in Australia. Last year, it made over $1 billion in revenue.
I feel like I maybe would have first heard about it through like podcast and YouTube advertising. You know, they sponsor an awful lot of videos and a lot of podcasts and stuff like that.
They sure do. According to Magellan AI, in July of this year, BetterHelp spent more than any other brand on podcast sponsorships, hitting well over $7 million in July alone. Their monthly YouTube ad spend is in the millions too.
When you sign up, you have to fill out a health questionnaire, and we're going to talk more about that later. Now, after being matched with a therapist, Rachel wrote to her describing her issues. 3 days later, she received a pretty impersonal and stock-sounding response.
Something along the lines of the stereotypical sort of, oh, interesting, how does that make you feel? It just sort of immediately gave me a bit of a bad feel, and I just thought this person isn't actually really engaging with any of what I talked about.
She eventually switched therapist and tried to arrange a video call, but the therapist didn't show up. After that, Rachel left the platform.
It felt like there was nobody in BetterHelp that cared because it was just matching me up with these randomers. There was no like central person or team. Nobody reached out to me like after the failed voice calls or anything like that.
The internet is full of stories about people who've had bad experiences with BetterHelp. From a young woman with an eating disorder whose therapist dangerously missed the mark.
What she said to me there was, "Oh, good for you. Congratulations on all that weight loss." Deleted the chat, deleted the app, and never advocated for myself again.
To a guy whose therapist seemed, well, distracted.
She would go off of camera sometimes, and do other stuff. So I do another one, same thing. She's going off of camera. This time she's in Austria on vacation.
We know clients are far more likely to share bad experiences than good, and we will actually hear a positive BetterHelp experience later. But first, we need to figure out what's happening on the other side. Becky, not her real name, worked at BetterHelp for 5 years.
I call BetterHelp the Uber of mental health. Because people have this expectation that they're going to sign up and then automatically be able to see a therapist, but that's not how it works.
BetterHelp is a classic gig economy model. Therapists can work flexibly online as much or as little as they want.
It was a lot during COVID, which is to be expected. So I was doing that plus working full time. They do have an incentive program where the more clients you see, the higher your pay rate will be, which to me is super unethical. They have a messaging system, so they did expect you to constantly message people, which is very annoying and stressful. And you got paid for a certain amount of word count.
Carly Dober is the director of the Australian Association of Psychologists. She's got serious misgivings about BetterHelp's recent expansion into Australia.
The work of the staff is not accurately valued. And also the privacy and confidentiality concerns about patient data and information is very, very concerning.
Remember that health questionnaire Rachel and Joe filled out when they signed up? It includes questions about your sexuality, relationship status, religion, physical health, and financial status. Last year, the Federal Trade Commission accused BetterHelp of sharing those health questionnaires along with clients' email and IP addresses with companies including Facebook and Snapchat. The company was fined $7.8 million. Competitor Cerebral got a similar fine this year. As well as privacy concerns, there's also the question of liability. Both Rachel and Joe live in Europe, but were initially matched with therapists in the US. In Germany, for example, if this were offline, those providers wouldn't be able to practice outside of their country without going through a lengthy process of having their qualifications recognised. BetterHelp says it only hires registered or licensed counsellors, psychologists, social workers and therapists. But depending on what jurisdiction you're in, take Australia for example, what those terms mean can vary.
therapist is absolutely not a protected title. Anyone can call themselves a therapist or a counsellor, irrespective if they've actually engaged in any kind of formal education or training about that.
So if there are so many pitfalls, how come the business model hasn't collapsed? Well, the thing is, sometimes it does work out for people. Here's Joe talking about the second Betterhelp therapist he was matched with.
I made sure that that was the main thing he was doing. It wasn't like he was a waiter on the side. Like, that was his main focus. And I really saw a massive change in quality based on that, because he was like absolutely great. He was exactly what I wish I would have gotten 2 years previously.
I reached out to Betterhelp for clarification on a number of issues raised in this video, from working hours to data sharing and license checking, but I received no response.
Joe and Rachel both paid out of pocket for their online therapy, but actually the trend is moving away from that.
Steve Duke works as an advisor to mental health companies. He says online therapy platforms are seeking out new payers.
More and more, especially the bigger ones, it's not the consumer who's actually paying. It's very often either insurers or employers or schools.
This applies to Diego. Remember, we heard from him right at the beginning. In 2023, he was going through a crazily stressful period professionally.
It was like going to work every day, like if it was a video game. It was like a very third person feeling. And that moment was when there was like, okay, I think I'm losing my mind. Like at this point, I think I'm going nuts, like completely.
One of the perks of Diego's company was access to a platform called Open Up. Through it, he started seeing a professional.
All of a sudden I was like, hey, it's okay to feel bad for a while, right? Okay, I have these anxieties coming because whatever is happening tomorrow at work, but now I know what it is. I know I can just sit and think through it.
As rates of mental health issues increase, employers are increasingly offering workers access to online therapy platforms.
If you go onto any of these companies' sites, you go to their like for a business section, all of the stats are around how they reduce absenteeism from employees, how they increase worker productivity by providing mental health. So like that's the pitch.
But is outsourcing your mental health to your employer really the answer? At the beginning of this video, we looked at some of the economic factors that are contributing to poor mental health. And we looked at why young people are struggling to attain the stability their parents had.
People are working, workers' rights have been decimated in many countries and many fields. For many people, going to university is either inaccessible or it doesn't really mean the same or lead to the same opportunities that it might have 10 or 20 years ago.
In a world of mass layoffs and increasingly precarious working conditions, relying on your employer for mental health support can seem a little off. I put that to Steve Duke.
I think like, first of all, like, we can probably separate those two things, right? So it's like, of course, something like laying off people is like a risk factor for somebody's like mental health. But at the same time, does that mean that they shouldn't also provide like mental health services to their employees? Like, of course not, right? Like both of those things can be true. It can be true that it's bad to lay people off, and it can also be true that it's good to offer them mental health services.
But even a good job with benefits is no longer a guarantee of economic stability. In Ireland, where Rachel lives, the housing crisis means young people are spending years of their life in uncertain living arrangements.
I think there is a kind of a trauma in our generation to do with the fact that we have that instability. I think particularly in Ireland, there's a borderline obsession with property. You haven't made it in life like until you own a house. That's very much the mentality that a lot of our generation are in, is that it's kind of hopeless. I do think that contributes an awful lot to mental health problems.
Another issue affecting younger generations more than their parents, the ubiquity of smartphones.
Diego was literally holding his phone up like this when he spoke the next few words.
I think that eventually this will be banned, at least for minors. I think this is cancer. This is horrible. This is like we are giving cigarettes to everyone. That's my feeling about it. It's like, I hate it. I'm a technologist. I'm a computer scientist. I hate this.
There are reasons to be cynical about the idea of tech companies involved in mental health. But given the scale of the problem, some say we can't afford to ignore them.
I think private companies, where we've seen in mental health, in healthcare, in almost every other industry, they're exceptional at innovation, and they're much better than public health systems. If you take a step back and look at mental health, we need significant innovation.
So how can online therapy platforms like Betterhelp improve?
they need to sort out their compensation and their incentives. I think there's like some really basic stuff that they can do. Like a lot of the therapists aren't offered any equity or any of the share option schemes in some of these companies. I really don't understand like why that is. Because then when these companies come out and they get billion-dollar valuations, like therapists would be a lot happier if they had equity.
So definitely screening people, having probably a better platform to use and less about, messaging and more about actually providing good care, not stealing people's cookies, or private information.
Reporting this story has opened my eyes to just how inaccessible mental health care can be. But it's also made me realise that without addressing our economic system as a risk factor, demand for services will only grow.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What's mental health care like where you are? And do you agree that economic factors are making the problem worse? Let us know. Thanks so much for watching, and see you again soon.